And hopefully, can everybody see that good? I'll assume so, unless somebody says something. uh, so I was asked to, I'm excited about this because it is a little bit different than some of the talks that I have given in the past. I do focus a great deal of my research on the relationship between religion, spirituality, and the brain itself, a field that some people have referred to as neurotheology, and we'll kind of touch on that throughout. But this is a little bit different of a presentation, and so I'm excited to give this and to see the feedback that I can get from everyone. It is about identity and the brain, and certainly this has a great deal of relevance in terms of the work that I have been involved in over the many, many years. Some of you, I don't know how old everyone is there, but some of you may remember my late mentor, Eugene DeQuilly, Gene, who introduced me to Star Island and had been there for many, many years, I think going back into the certainly the 1980s and maybe even before that. And what was fascinating, I think, about the work that I started doing with Gene many, many years ago, and so thrilled to be able to continue on with that work since his untimely passing, is that a lot of the early work was actually around rituals, and he was an anthropologist as well as a psychiatrist. And so there was a lot of interest in the relationship between our rituals that we have and what they do for us in terms of the rituals of religious and spiritual beliefs. But what was intriguing about that, and I think what ties into the talk today, is that rituals in human beings ultimately arose from rituals in animals, was one of his very primary and early arguments. But what was interesting about that is that rituals in animals were essentially mating rituals, and mating rituals have a primary function of bringing two individuals together who normally are not. So normally each animal has its own identity and kind of keeps to a certain extent to their own self. And certainly this is the case in some of the predatory species where, one lion or a bear will have an area to itself, but yet somehow during the mating process, that identity, that aloneness that they have, has to be altered in such a way that allows the mating process to occur. And probably, at least, the argument that we were making many years ago at the start of all this was that it was through the mating rituals that there was this breakdown of the self-other dichotomy that allowed for mating to occur. Then start to move that into the realm of human beings, where not only do we have mating rituals, which serve the same function of bringing two of us together for mating, but the rituals became encephalized into the brain, into the higher areas of the brain that we'll be talking about in a few moments, and had something to do with how our self forms and how our self relates to the world in general, and how our self relates to something spiritual, such as God or ultimate reality, some type of universal consciousness, depending on whatever your particular belief system is. So I realized that this whole idea about identity in the brain becomes very relevant. In fact, I had been working on some articles related to this a number of years ago that I'm hoping that this will rekindle that and be able to push this kind of concept forward. So again, today I'm going to be talking about this idea about identity and the brain and where our self comes from. And I'm going to kind of touch on these different points that I just mentioned, a little bit of what our self actually is on a very biological level, how that ultimately comes to the fore in our brain, what happens to that self when it is engaged in the concepts of human consciousness, which certainly we talk about self-consciousness, and how it can be affected in the context of various religious and spiritual experiences and practices. So to go back to the very beginning, at least biologically, where does a self come from? Well, when you first looked into a microscope back in elementary school or high school or whatever, we saw cells in that microscope, and cells have a membrane that separates the cell, in this case, the self of the cell, from the rest of the world. And of course, what's interesting, and this is where, already just even at this level, we see some very intriguing things happening, is that membrane doesn't just completely wall the self of that cell off from the rest of the world. It is typically referred to as semi-permeable, which means that it lets certain things in and certain things out of the cell. And this is essential for the cell's survival. So certain molecules, they could be food molecules, they could be oxygen, they could be other proteins that might be necessary for the cell to function. And of course, as it produces certain molecules in itself, and maybe certain things are a bit toxic to the cell, it allows the cell to remove that. It may allow water to come in so that a cell can be more hydrated or less hydrated. But ultimately, it's this membrane that maintains the cell's integrity and maintains the cell's self. Of course, our body is made up of quadrillions of cells. I'm not even sure what the actual number is estimated at anymore. But basically, what's intriguing about that is that all of the cells in our body, on one hand, have their own uniqueness to them. They all do have a cell membrane, but they also all become part of us. And so that becomes very important. In fact, there are very specific proteins that form on the outside of virtually every one of our cells that are actually called the major histocompatibility complex, or MHC. And these proteins enable the cells in our body to recognize each other and to recognize ourself, our body, from the non-body. And this is essential for maintaining the integrity of our overall body, as well as for warding off things from the outside, things like bacteria, viruses, and obviously, coronavirus comes to the front of my mind here. That when that virus enters into our body, then we have our immune systems that see that virus or a bacteria, and they're looking for this MHC, and they say it doesn't have it, so I'm going to attack it. And it's for the same reason that there's on some hands this is extremely helpful for maintaining our health and well-being, but sometimes it interferes with that as well. So sometimes we develop autoimmune diseases where our immune system is not recognizing this MHC properly, for example, and starts to attack our own cells, and it can cause inflammation. It can cause a disease like lupus or multiple sclerosis or something like that. And then the other problem that we sometimes face more specifically in the medical world is when we do transplantation. So if you take somebody else's kidney and put it into your kidney, it has different proteins on it. And that's why we have to give very strong immunosuppressive medications to prevent your immune system from attacking that. Now, interestingly, the MHC is ultimately determined by the genetics. And the MHC is not the only thing that establishes ourself, but it's certainly an important one. But it is our genetics that make us who we are. And so that ultimately, again, our genetics helps to define not only what's going on the cellular level, but all the aspects of what we are made of, whether we have curly hair or straight hair, brown eyes or blue eyes, how tall we ultimately become, various aspects of how our brain operates and our cognitive processes, our emotional processes. And, it helps to, it's in large part our genetics that lead us down certain pathways in our lives that make certain things interesting to us. And, as they say, that's why there's vanilla and chocolate, for example. Now, obviously, our genetics are just one piece of this, and all of the environmental factors that are out there have a profound influence in forming that self. So the genetics, as we sometimes talk about here in integrative medicine, they're the blueprints of who we are. They're the blueprints of the building. But how you decide to make that building could be very, very different, and what kind of building blocks that you actually use. If you use good wood and good concrete and so forth, then you have a wonderful building, even if the genetics is not quite as good. And sometimes even if you have great genetics, if you don't take care of that building properly, it falls apart. So the genetics is part of that process of creating the biological aspect of ourself. Now, there's a barrier around the cells of the body, but there is a barrier around our own body, our whole body, which again separates us from the world. But much like the cell membranes, has an ability to allow certain things in and certain things out. So our body and our brain have a kind of physical separation. And in fact, our brain, as we'll talk about, literally helps us from a spatial perspective and a sensorial perspective to separate ourselves from the world. And to some degree, this creates a sense of exclusivity, if you will, which is critical to survival. We need to know where our self is and where our self ends. I mean, there, as far as I know, with very, very few exceptions, and usually very strange ones, we don't eat ourselves. We don't eat our leg off because we're hungry. We eat something else. We recognize what is ourself and what is not ourself. So we need to be able to identify ourself and distinguish that self from the rest of the world. And that becomes, again, essential for our survival. Of course, we have to also be able to recognize where that self is in relation to the world. We need to be able to identify objects in the world. We need to be able to avoid dangers like, walking in front of a train or off of a cliff. We need to know things that might be good or useful, such as food or fluids that we want to drink or take in. And so, this becomes very, very important. And on the other hand, if we take this whole process too far, if we become so exclusive that we ignore aspects of the external world, then that can be detrimental. So there's always a balance that occurs between what we feel that we need to include, so to speak, in our world and in our life, things that we need to exclude, and how we differentiate ourselves from the rest of the world. This occurs, again, biologically, but it also occurs psychologically and neurologically as well, as we'll talk about. So, in fact, this has led me to think a little bit about this idea about inclusivity and exclusivity. It goes back even to the concept of rituals that Jean DeQuilly and I used to talk about. We often talked about the importance of rituals in creating a sense of inclusivity of a group, but actually creating a greater sense of exclusivity against other groups. So this whole concept of inclusivity and exclusivity, I think, is a very important aspect of ourself. So once we have a biological sense of ourself, what is exclusive of ourself, again, we need to create some kind of balance. So as I was mentioning a few moments ago, biologically, we need to take in food, we need to take in nutrients. We need to be careful about things that we should exclude. We need to know, which plants are going to be poisonous to us, which ones should be incorporated into our body, and which things should not be. And that biological balance becomes very important. It becomes important for health and well-being, physical health and well-being, as well as psychological and social health and well-being. Which people do we include in our world? Which people should we exclude? Who should we avoid? And it is something that we ultimately have to kind of keep tabs on all the time. Our brain and our body have to do this every single moment of every single day. Every time you take a breath, you're bringing something into your body. You're bringing in oxygen, you're bringing in different gases. And of course, sometimes you're bringing in poisons, and sometimes you're bringing in, other problems that you could bring in viruses or bacteria. I've been wearing masks for two or 3 years to try to avoid us from breathing in the coronavirus. So there's a very important aspect about how we think about what our self is and what things we include or exclude as part of that self. Now, I mentioned that there is obviously a great influence on our biology of the social aspects of our interactions with others. So socially, we are going to interact with and communicate with others. And I should say that it extends obviously beyond just purely human beings. We interact with other animals, pets, and so forth, become an important part of our lives. But more importantly here, I think, we're talking about how we interact and communicate with other human beings. This is essential, again, for our survival. Our ability to socialize and create a kind of a larger sense of self becomes very, very relevant. We need to be able to exchange our ideas, that the ability to have language and to be able to communicate with others becomes very, very relevant in terms of how we establish our own self and how we communicate ideas or incorporate ideas into the ways in which we want to believe. And they could be religious and spiritual ideas, moral beliefs, political beliefs, and so forth. And then ultimately, we wind up forming various cooperative alliances with people, which could be one other person as perhaps a spouse. It could be a family. It could be your larger community, state, country, all of humanity, ultimately. But that in and of itself, to me, is always kind of fascinating, especially when we think about in-group versus out-group. And there's so many studies out there that show that, even if you make an arbitrary separation, even if you take it if I were to take go to your room and just say everybody on the left is a group and everybody on the right is a different group, you would ultimately start to see why your group was better than the other group, and what was good and what good about your group, what's bad about the other group. So our brain is kind of set up for this us versus them mentality, because that becomes part of our survival. But what's fascinating to me is how that can be expanded as we do move through these different sort of social levels, if you will. And when Jean DeQuilly and I talked a lot about rituals, you can have family rituals which bind the family together, but then you might have, I always think I'm a big fan of sports. So I think about, you could be just your family playing another family in basketball or something like that. But then your community has the basketball team, and that's, maybe made of your high school students or something like that. But then there's the state team, and then there's, your maybe your city team, or then you go to the Olympics and it's your country team. And of course, if there was other worlds out there, then maybe it'd be Earth versus the other countries. That's always the big science fiction. When we have to battle the aliens that come down, all of humanity suddenly becomes one, and we don't care about whether you're Democrat or Republican. We got to fight this other thing. So our sense of self and what we include as part of that self becomes very, very important. But of course, all of this, again, kind of comes from this idea of the mating rituals, that sexually we ultimately have to decide who is our immediate group, and then how that has repercussions in terms of the elaboration of our family, community, and so forth. So there's a lot of really fascinating aspects that come up, I think, when we start to talk about how we create our sense of self and expand that sense of self into the world. And I would argue that also, when it comes to our sense of self, what we're also talking about now on the really more humanistic level are the beliefs and ideas that we hold. So each one of us has our sense of morals, our sense of our political beliefs, social beliefs, religious and spiritual beliefs, and those two are part of our self. So we decide, what is inclusive in who we are, what makes me, Andrew Newberg, what makes each one of you your own self. But also, and then we kind of evaluate how the ideas that I hold are similar or dissimilar to somebody else. And then, but just like this, the semi-permeable membrane of the cell, some ideas come in and we incorporate them, and they become our new perspective, our new beliefs in ourselves and the ways that we want to look at the world. Other ideas we exclude. So it becomes very important for us to think about the cultural and the social influences on ourself, and what makes sense to our brain, what doesn't make sense to our brain, and how we continually construct and reconstruct our existing belief system, the prevailing belief system that we have, which again extends over many different domains of human behavior and human thought. So, this to me is now kind of heading us in the direction of how our brain ultimately operates, the different parts of our brain that help us to manage those beliefs and continually assess which ideas are good and which ideas are problematic. And of course, in today's world of social media, we see these very fascinating issues coming about in terms of how the media feeds us information. And, all of these devices that we go on, as we have come to learn, when you go on your phone, when you go on your apps and so forth, there's algorithms there that in some sense are sort of helping you to manage your beliefs. But part of the problem is that you don't always know that they're doing that to you. And so if you have a particular belief system, if you are a Democrat, then you're going to continue to go to websites that support the beliefs because those are the things that you like and that you're interested in. And then they realize that those are the beliefs and the ideas that you keep coming back to, and then they keep feeding you into your own belief system. And of course, that's true for everyone. So, this, again, is really quite fascinating about how our brain begins to develop the ideas that we hold as ourself, as who we are as a person, and how those ideas relates to those who are outside of ourself and who we begin to include or exclude as part of that sense of self. Okay, so now we're ready to talk a little bit more about the actual sort of neurobiological correlates of the self. So where in our brain now do these processes begin to occur? I wasn't really sure exactly where to start this, but I decided that since we're saying that there is this kind of boundary between ourself, a physical boundary between ourselves and the external world, where does the interaction occur at all? Well, it occurs on that boundary level, and it occurs through the sensory systems that we have that enable us to perceive the external world and to a large extent also perceive ourselves. So We have our eyes that can see the world around us. And of course, we can see ourselves too. But that allows us to visually see the world. Our ears and hearing allow us to understand what we're listening to and pick up sounds that might be okay for us or sounds that might be dangerous for us. Our tongue with taste, being able to taste things that are good that we want to eat and incorporate into ourselves, things that taste badly that we want to exclude from ourselves. And that obviously is a very important way in which we have evolved and developed so that we eat the right things and we don't eat the wrong things. Even smells through our nose become very relevant. We know when things smell bad and maybe it's time to leave. When things smell good, like a flower or something like that, that we want to pay attention to. And then the more proximate is our skin, what actually touches us, and whether what is touching us is good, somebody caressing us or giving us a massage, for example, versus somebody punching us and causing us to have a very negative feeling of touch. And I didn't add this one, but actually I'm just realizing now, but we also have internal receptors. So it's called proprioception, and that is how we actually perceive our body's actions. So when I'm moving my hands here, I know that I have lifted my hand. Even if my eyes are closed, I know that I have lifted my hand up or down. I know that I might be reaching out if I lift my leg. And it's essential for us to move through the world, to be able to walk. We need to know where our knees and our feet are. But that proprioception also helps to define ourself. Now, the sensory processes, so we have the sensory organs, the ears, eyes, tongue, and so forth, but they receive information from the outside world, which interestingly, going back to the theme of rituals, one of the most fundamentally important aspects of rituals is that they are rhythmic. And what's fascinating about that is that in many ways, the entire world are rhythms, including our overall perspective of ourself. And those rhythms occur on a very fundamental level, even at the level of physics, to our biology level, our circadian rhythms, our heart rhythms, our brain rhythms, and so forth, to the rhythms that we notice in the world around us, the seasons, and so forth. So rhythms become a fundamental part of everything that we do. And of course, our sensory systems also are based on rhythms. When you think about visual stimuli, you're really talking about visual, light waves. When you're talking about sound, you're talking about sound waves. So there's these different rhythms that have an impact on the eyes or ears, and then they are transmitted to very specific areas of our brain that tend to more or less focus on each of these different sensory systems. So the thalamus, a very central structure, brings in vision as well as hearing up into the brain, and that goes to the cortical areas that enable us to create this very vivid three-dimensional representation of the world. We have an olfactory cortex that helps us with the smells. We do have our parietal areas. We're going to see where all these areas are in a moment. That helps us with our sense of touch. And they basically provide the experience of the self as it relates to the world. So where are these areas? Well, they're kind of smattered throughout the brain. So I'm not sure if you can see my arrow, but if you start to the left of the image, you're looking at the frontal lobe, and that helps us to focus our attention. It also helps us to produce speech, which becomes a very important part of this rhythm between ourself and the external world, that we exude certain things. We exude language, we exude behaviors, and then we wait for a response, whether it's somebody talking back to us or whether it's something, moving in the world around us. If we push something out of the way, does it go out of the way? And then we continually are interacting with the world in that regard. Then we have, as we move a little bit back into the temporal lobes, we have parts of the auditory cortex, where we hear things, and this is also where we understand language. In the back of the brain, on the right side in green, is our primary visual cortex that helps us to reconstruct our visual representation of the world. Towards the top of the brain, in sort of the darker blue, we have our primary sensory cortex, which is called the postcentral gyrus. And then in the parietal lobes, a little bit more behind that, in sort of the lighter blue, that's where we have our somatic sensory association area. So this is where we have the areas of our brain that help us to perceive this sort of spatial and physical representation of the self. So our frontal lobes do help us with all of our executive processes. They help you plan your day. So when you get up in the morning and you're trying to think about all the things that you need to do, I need to go to work, I need to make these calls, I need to get something for dinner. It's the executive processes in the frontal lobe that help you to figure out what you yourself needs to do, and helps you focus attention on the things that you need to do in your day. So your behaviors that you need to enact throughout the rest of the day. And in that regard, the frontal lobe helps you to initiate and engage those behaviors, as well as language. So if you decide that you're going to do something altruistic or charitable today, it's the frontal lobe that initiates that process. If you're going to go and play sports, or if you're going to take a walk, or you're going to do something at work, this is where the frontal lobes come in. And interestingly, the frontal lobes also regulate our own emotional processes. Of course, it does this in conjunction with the limbic system, which is primarily in the temporal lobes, and kind of deeper in, and I have a picture in a second to show that, but this is where our emotions come in. And of course, emotions are fundamentally important to our sense of self. They help us to establish the good and the bad that has happened to us when we, get a good grade on a paper, or when when we get a successful business transaction or something like that. Then our emotions turn on and we feel good. Our reward system kicks in and we say, oh, this is good. I have done something good. When we do something bad, when we lose at something, and certainly if we do something that is wrong, we cheated or we stole something, then we have our negative emotions that come about and tell us that we did something wrong. And it's through these emotional processes that we continue to elaborate who we are as a person, the things that we want to do, the things that are important to us. In fact, that's why the limbic system is deeply tied into our memory processes. So structures like the amygdala and the hippocampus not only have our emotions, harbor our emotions, but use those emotions to remember things. And that makes sense, right? You want to remember the things that are emotionally important to you. We all have 365 days out of the year, but you may only remember one or two because that was, your birthday or an anniversary, or, you got married or something like that, because it was very emotionally important. It could be positive or negative. If you get hit by a car, you're going to remember that day. But if you just kind of get up in the morning, go to work and come home, your brain sort of says, okay, that wasn't that important. And it kind of keeps moving on. So our brain tries to help us to remember the things that are the most emotionally important, because those are the most important things that define ourself, both good and bad, and then help us to help that self survive. And as I mentioned, the parietal lobe is also involved in that spatial representation of the self and the world around us. And we're going to see some brain scans a little bit later to help us understand that even more. And here's an image of the limbic areas. So you can see the hippocampus and the amygdala. They're, again, very central structures. And you can also get a sense that the cortex is kind of wrapped around the limbic system. So, many animals have the limbic system that helps them with their emotional responses, which are necessary for establishing the fight or flight response, helping them decide affiliative and social behaviors that many, many animals, especially many mammals and higher primates have. But it also, the cortex then kind of wraps around. I mentioned a term a little while ago called encephalize, how the rituals were encephalized into the brain. So as the brain grew, these emotional processes then start to connect up into the brain, so that when we do have a certain thought, whether it's a political thought, a religious thought, it's associated with an emotional response. We think of God and we feel love or compassion, or maybe we feel fear. And so it's these different emotional processes that help to define who we are and help us to establish the beliefs that we hold. So, hang on, sorry. Let me just, back to here. Now, this starts to lead us, we're talking a lot about the self, and, on a very basic level, on a basic biological level, we interact with the world. And so, we know which things to eat and not eat. We know how to avoid bumping into things because our self is kind of taking care of itself. But in human beings in particular, and possibly in a few other animals, some of the higher primates and maybe some mammals like dolphins, there seems to be another layer of this sense of self, which we typically call consciousness. Consciousness, of course, is one of the most complex, confusing, and challenging issues for all of us to have, because on a very basic level, we feel we have it, and yet we almost never find a way to actually be able to measure it or look at it. And certainly, as my own self, I have no way of knowing that any of you have consciousness unless I have some kind of interaction with you and you tell me that you have it. But even there, I have no way of actually knowing whether you're all just automatons and I'm the only one who has consciousness, or whether we all have it. Now, on a medical level, consciousness has had different terms. On a very basic level, it's awakeness. Are you awake or are you not awake? And if you're not awake, you could be normal. It could be you're asleep, or you could be in a coma or something, much worse in terms of that. But then we talk about awareness and the idea that, when we're talking about some of those terms before, that we have a taste of something, that we see something in the world, that we don't just react to it as a video camera would looking at something, but we are aware that we are looking at something, and then we are aware that it is ourself that is looking at things. And so this creates all kinds of fascinating, this is probably one of the most interesting areas of neuroscience, as well as philosophy and religion and spirituality, about, what exactly is consciousness? How do we study it? How do we explore it? We have what seem to be altered states of consciousness that we'll talk about. And again, it leads to some fascinating philosophical questions and even biological questions about the nature of our own identity and our own self. So there have been different models of awareness, of consciousness. I took this as a figure out of a book that we published a little while ago called How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain. We're actually in the process of working on, I'm in the process of working on another book where we've been talking about different theologians. Lonergan, for example, has a very similar kind of model in terms of biological, psychological, and spiritual. But this goes into a lot of what I've already been saying, that, on a very basic level, there's this sort of biological awareness. We're aware of the world around us. We have senses of touch and vision, and that's our basic awareness, our instinctual awareness. And we can respond to that. If we taste something bad, we won't eat it again. That's just, we don't have to think about that inherently. It's just our habitual responsiveness to that. But then as we start to get up into our higher brain and into our psyche, we begin to have decision-making, we begin to have creative processes that allow us to think beyond just what we're reacting to. And it is through that we really start to develop our own personal sense of self, who we are as a person, what we think we need to do in the world, what we may feel we are called to do, or how we process our own self in the world. And then this enters into a notion of self-reflective awareness, which is that higher level of consciousness that frequently is associated with something spiritual, something beyond the body. And of course, we can get into all kinds of larger questions about the duality of our brain and our mind and our consciousness. Fascinating questions, which I'm really just throwing out there. But obviously, this is a great group for all of you to think about and have more and more discussions about that. And then, which is fascinating to me and a lot of the work that I did with Jean DeQuilly, was the notion of some kind of transformational awareness, something that really feels that we go beyond ourself, that we go beyond our consciousness, and probably engages many different parts of our brain, including some of the higher cortical areas, but also the amygdala, the limbic areas, and some of the body processes as well. When you get into these transformational processes, there is a deep interconnectedness between the brain and the body, between our brain and mind, however we want to think about those differentiations. But again, really fascinating. And I think this just kind of helps to give us a little bit of a model of how we kind of construct that self from the ground up, so to speak, from reality up to higher levels of consciousness. Now, how do we study consciousness? Well, this is where I feel, topics like neurotheology start to come in. We can look at consciousness in various religious and spiritual individuals, people who are engaged in practices like meditation and prayer, and how it changes their brain and how it changes their perception of their self, and how that self relates to the world. And especially when you talk about mystical experiences, when people feel that they get beyond their own self, they get beyond their own ego consciousness, and they become one with God, they become one with the universe. So these very powerful spiritual experiences that often derive out of various ritualistic practices like meditation and other spiritual rituals, but can happen, spontaneously as well. So in fact, these kinds of experiences seem to be able to occur in a number of different circumstances. psychedelic experiences, which radically changed a person's notion of their self. And obviously, and many of you may be aware that in today's psychiatric community, there's a lot of emphasis on looking at the potential value of psychedelic compounds in helping individuals deal with various psychological problems like depression, like anxiety, like post-traumatic stress disorder. The idea is that it kind of helps them to reestablish their sense of self in a new way that allows them to move forward in a more positive direction and gets them away from a lot of these very negative things that have happened to their own self. Near-death experiences are perhaps even more fascinating of an issue when it comes to ourself. The idea that in many of these experiences, when the person is physiologically at death, their heart has stopped, that their brain continues to operate at least for some period of time. And people certainly describe these fascinating experiences where they leave their self. They feel that they float up to the corner of the room, that they can go down the hall and see some, the redheaded gentleman in the room next door who's struggling with cancer or something like that. They can see what the nurse looked like or the doctor who looked like, even though as far as the doctors and the nurses go, they feel that this person is dead and has no communication with them in any way, shape, or form. People are studying these near-death experiences and trying to see if the experience of getting beyond the body seems to actually occur, and seems, this is a really interesting area of research because they are unique experiences. They are somewhat known as to when they are going to happen. So you could do studies in trauma bays and certain areas of a hospital where people are more likely to die than in other areas, and then try to see if we can understand and validate whatever experiences people describe. That this could be paradigm shifting if we can actually show that what anecdotally people report in near-death experiences really has a validity, that they get beyond their self. We can study consciousness in other people. So this can include normal consciousness, altered states using neuroimaging techniques. So again, a lot of what I was just talking about in terms of psychedelic experiences near death, that's people who are having those experiences, and we can try to now get at what those are through imaging. We can look at different neurological disorders, people who have tumors and strokes. There's been some interesting studies, for example, that have shown that if you have a tumor or a stroke in the parietal lobe, which is very involved in our sense of self, that they are more likely to express feelings of self-transcendence, of getting beyond the self, than if you have a tumor or stroke in other areas of the brain. And certainly there are well-known dissociative types of states and psychotic states and schizophrenia, where again, the person has very, very unusual experiences of the self. They may enter, it used to be called multiple personality disorder. Now it's called dissociative identity disorder, where people have these multiple personalities and they actually kind of become different selves. What does that mean? And are they somehow accessing these different selves in the brain? Is it all, all a mishmash? Do we all have them? Is it just unusual? Usually they occur under very traumatic circumstances, but, fascinating things for us to think about in terms of how we understand the self. You can study consciousness within your own self through introspective, through contemplation, through meditation, and the kinds of experiences that you may have. And there may even be some fascinating areas where we get more specifically at things like consciousness and the self in other things, other animals, primates, dolphins, other animals. And of course, the whole world of computers and artificial intelligence has been very inundated with concepts of consciousness. Can we build a computer that ultimately has self-awareness and self-consciousness? Can we do that? Are we basically just incredibly complex computers, or is there something fundamentally different between the biological computer, if you will, of a human being and a physical computer that we create at IBM or something like that? So these are all, again, wonderfully exciting questions for us to think about, and gives us a lot of direction to go in the future. Now, when it comes to your own personal experiences, this is fundamental in terms of helping each one of us, understand our own self. So it is, I think, of value to study your own sense of consciousness, your own sense of awareness, and your own sense of self through various meditation techniques, altered states of consciousness, thinking about dreams and how, when you're dreaming, you actually have consciousness. Often you're aware of the fact that there's things going on in that dream. But interestingly, you're typically not aware that you are actually dreaming itself, although there's also lucid dreaming where people actually do that. So, there are some very, very fascinating approaches that can be taken. I do not advocate for people to try drug-induced states, but certainly there are lots of people out there who do. And that is something that also is another way for us to explore our own sense of self and our own personal experiences. And there are a lot of new technologies out there, brain stimulation approaches like transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, where we can stimulate different parts of the brain like the parietal lobe and alter our sense of self and our various perspectives on ourself. So, there's ways of looking at others, there's ways of looking internally, and they all can potentially be useful. The neuroimaging studies that I've been involved in over the past 25 years also can be very helpful in looking at the brain structures involved in our different mental states, and that can include the neurophysiological correlates of selfhood, of consciousness, and of course, this is fascinating, and there's some really great research that can be done, but it has its own limitations. And the biggest one, I wrote a book called Principles of Neurotheology, and in there, one of the concepts I talk about is Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which many of you may know of. In the physics world, it has to do with how we measure things, and there's a certain limitation to which we can measure something exactly, because as we measure something, we affect it. Well, to a certain extent, we wind up with a kind of neurotheological uncertainty principle as well, which is that if we use neuroimaging, if we use brain stimulation, then we're altering the thing that we are trying to measure. We're altering the consciousness. And, unfortunately, if I brought one of you into our lab and helped you to try to, through meditation, get into some kind of mystical state, there's no way, I can't tap you on the shoulder and ask you, are you outside of yourself yet? Because if you'd said yes, then you're already back in yourself. So, how do we kind of capture these very complex issues of consciousness through neuroimaging? I mean, we can get at it, we can chip away at it, but there are certainly some very important limitations that we have to think about. So these, I do want to spend a few minutes before concluding here. I know we got started a little bit late, so I'm going to try to go another maybe 5 minutes or so about these very core brain-related elements of transformative experiences, the self-transformative experiences. So these are the kinds of spiritual, mystical experiences that take people beyond their self. And it does so because of a number of important elements, which include feelings of intensity, clarity, unity, surrender, and the transformative the permanence of the transformation. So what do I mean by each of these? I want to spend a few moments here. This was a description of a spiritual experience, a very intense spiritual experience by a 43-year-old male. This was part of a survey that we had done dating about 5 to 10 years ago, where we asked people about their most intense spiritual experiences. Of course, in many of them, they get beyond the self. And it says, I, as an unnameable but individual being, so already we're touching on this selfhood issue, was traveling down an infinite roller coaster like waves of pure white ecstatic light. The ecstasy was overwhelming and rose and fell in intensity with the waves of light. The light path seemed infinitely long in both directions. The sense of the being and the light was infinitely more real than anything I had ever experienced. And by the way, the capitals there were from the person, not from us. So what do I mean by this? Part of it is that when we experience ourself in the world, it is a very intense experience. When somebody touches us, we feel the intensity of that experience. When we look, right now I'm looking outside at a parking lot and I see cars and they're very crisp and clear and I can see them. So there's an intensity of the experience which identifies it as being real for me. But the intensity of these profound experiences seems to be even greater. There's something that distinguishes these experiences of reality from the everyday reality experiences that we have. Now, where in the brain does this intensity come from? Well, part and parcel of where we think it might be coming from is our limbic system. And that's where this arrow is pointing. This is during a baseline state of a person. And this is a brain scan showing activity. It actually looks at blood flow. The red areas are the most active, followed by the yellow, the blue, and the black. And so this is a resting state of the brain. And where this arrow is pointing is along the side of the brain at the limbic system. And you can see the difference between the brain here at rest and when the person is deep in meditation. This limbic area has turned on, signifying that it is a very important, very intense kind of state for the individual, and therefore leading to a very prominent, very important experience. There's also a sense of clarity in these experiences. And this was a description by a female scientist who said, everything in life seemed to click. I had this clarity, and it was as if I was looking at life from the inside out. Despite my trepidation, this experience seemed to satisfy my proof-oriented mentality with the concept of intuition. It was almost as if my intuition from somewhere deeper had offered up some sort of direct experience that offered up a proof. So again, you see all these really interesting references to the self, something deeper. What does that mean? Is that her? Is that coming from something outside, even though it feels like it's coming from inside? And this sense of clarity is this notion that a person understands the world for the very first time in a new way. And one of the areas that we think might be involved in this is a very central structure called the thalamus, which is where the arrow is pointing here. Again, here's a baseline scan. And this is a person who was not, this is a non-meditator actually, at rest. And you can see that the thalamus is relatively equal. There's kind of a little blob of red activity on both sides. But here is the resting brain scan of a very profound meditator, somebody who's been meditating for many, many years. And you can see that their thalamus seems to be asymmetric. The blob of red is now on one side over another. And a number of our studies have shown that there becomes these asymmetries in the thalamus. And if you recall back a little while ago, I said that the thalamus is involved in sensory processing, particular vision and hearing. But because of its central place in the brain, it helps different parts of the brain communicate with each other. So it would make sense that the thalamus is very crucial to our overall sense of reality and how we establish that sense of reality. So when we derive a new sense of clarity about that reality, it may make sense that the thalamus is partially responsible or substantially responsible for that kind of an experience. The sense of self really kind of comes to the fore when we talk about that sense of oneness, where the person gets beyond the self, or they feel as if their self becomes one with God, with the universe, the oneness of all things. And so, we think that this happens in large part in the parietal lobes, although there's some other areas, both of the temporal lobes as well, the superior part, the upper part of the temporal lobes that may be involved. But a lot of our brain scan studies, in fact, this was one of the very first brain scans we ever did when Jean DeQuilly was still with us. We started a study many, many years ago. And this was during Tibetan Buddhist meditation practice. Here is the resting scan with the arrow pointing at the parietal lobe. And this is what happens when the person is deeply engaged in their meditation. The parietal lobe starts to shut down. Well, if the parietal lobe normally helps us to establish that sense of self and that differentiation of the self and the world, then if it starts to quiet down, we lose that sense of self and we lose that sense of differentiation between ourselves and the world, that sense of oneness, that sense of connectedness, which is part of these kinds of experiences. The sense of surrender is also important. We surrender ourselves during these experiences. And here was a description of a Catholic woman who said, "I surrendered everything, including my faith and my salvation, and only for one reason. I loved God so much that I would truly give up everything to be connected with him. I said yes, and in an instant, God returned everything to me transformed. From that day forward, a new relationship exists between God and me. It is ever present, no distance, no separation. I am not attached to doctrine, dogmas, or rituals. I see God's actions all around me." So again, the sense of self becomes very affected. She gives herself over, but then herself becomes connected intimately with God in this particular case as an important part of the experience. And part of where we feel that sense of surrender may actually be occurring in the frontal lobes. You remember the frontal lobes are involved in our ability to focus attention. And we see here where the arrows are, this is the frontal lobes at rest. And then you can see some of these sort of pinkish or reddish areas, they go away. It becomes greens and yellows. The frontal lobe starts to quiet down. And we have seen this in a number of practices where the person does state that they surrender themselves to the process. We've seen this in Islamic prayer. We've seen this in speaking in tongues, where the person just kind of gives themselves over to the process. They're not making it happen. It's happening to them. But that has a profound influence on how they sense their self. And of course, the self does become deeply transformed by these experiences. When we ask people how they feel about their self in terms of their relationships, their fear of death, their sense of spirituality, their sense of meaning and purpose in life, far and away, almost everybody describes these experiences as being better, or these concepts as being better. So their self is truly transformed, and only a very limited number of people, really just a couple of percent, actually say that these kinds of self-transformation experiences make things worse. But in and of itself, that is important for us to think about, which is why do so many people have a positive experience. But what happens when sometimes these things become negative? And we do need to think about that. And this is a very important area for neurotheology going forward. I mentioned before, so I'm going to go through this very quickly, that we can study different types of neurological patients, especially in the context of the self, head injury, dementia, tumors, psychedelic experiences. All these different medical factors can affect our self-consciousness, and we can explore that, and we can try to study that, and we can study what happens. There's a very interesting stroke phenomenon called neglect, where if you have a stroke on one side of the brain, you actually think that the other side of your body isn't part of your body. So your whole sense of self is completely altered and affected by that. And then other people, if we cut certain parts of the brain out, their sense of self goes on. So again, fascinating possibilities here for us to think about. So the self and our self-consciousness is certainly one of the most mysterious aspects of the human being. On one hand, as I mentioned earlier, we all have it, but how do we prove it? It's extremely challenging for us to do that, even to ourselves. And we have a lot for us to learn in terms of altered states of consciousness, meditation, spiritual practices. What do they imply? What do they imply about consciousness itself, its relationship to the brain? How do we think about all of that? Are we always trapped within our brain and our self-consciousness? Can we get beyond the brain and our self-consciousness? And can we ever really know what the true nature of reality is, the reality which is out there, as well as the reality which is inside of ourself, and how we as human beings relate to that reality? And that, to me, is really the driving goal and object of the field of neurotheology and of all of this work, which is to help us understand our own self better, how that self relates to the world, and how our self can really know what the world is all about. So I will end it there. If any of you have interest in exploring some of these topics further, there are a number of books that we have published, and actually our new book that's coming out is September 1st, I understand. I was hoping it would be out by now, but called The Varieties of Spiritual Experience, an homage to William James's Varieties of Religious Experience with a 21st century update, so to speak, and talking about the nature of these experiences. And we're actually going to have a panel on Friday, which will touch on that a little bit more and how that relates to ourself and our self-identity as well. So I will leave it there, and thank you very much. And I will stop sharing, and I will open it up to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Andrew. For all of you that are watching via Zoom online, I want you to know that if you want to sign up for the rest of our conference, go to the IRIS website and you are welcome to do that. And at this point, if you want to ask, if you're watching online and you want to ask a question, you can go to the Q&A feature at the very bottom of your screen and put a question in there, and it will get asked to Andrew. And I will turn this now back over to Maynard. Thanks.
So do you see questions?
No, she's going to.
All right, thank you, Andy. And listen, those of you who want to get a little bit more information on what you have heard, this will be on our website, as all of our webinars are. They will be uploaded within a matter of days. I won't. Where's Caroline Johnson? We'll get this uploaded as soon as we can, so that you can listen to the whole thing again. Okay, so the respondent is Dr. Saul Katz, who needs no introduction. So why am I introducing him? He is Emeritus Professor of the Krogman Center at University of Philadelphia, and Editor-in-Chief of the encyclopedia of food. I like to say he knows more about the anthropology of food than anybody else in the world. So Saul, come make your comment and first question.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Well, pleasure to be here. Hi, Andy. Nice to see your face.
Nice to see you too. We have to get together for lunch.
I'll take off the mask. We wear masks in the room for this year. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you on this, and it's a pleasure to respond to you. So I'll get right into it. First thing I want to say is that Andy's presentation is the product of a lot of history of Iris, because it extends back into a time when he mentioned Jean de Quilly and the whole idea that in fact, if we understood more about the way our central nervous system operates, we may be able to understand some of the themes that underlie religious experience of all kinds. So it's very nice to hear you referring back to James and the whole side of that. I think it's really important for us to recognize that William James was asking questions like this 100 years ago. But the fact of the matter is that we were not able to answer them other than in a very broad way, but nevertheless, he was able to understand what the questions might be. And of course, now the questions are changing as we know more. And we see at the very end of your presentation, all these new questions that emerge as a result of the breakthroughs that you provided through your neurotheological methodology for imaging, because now the imaging can take place to tell you what specific areas of the brain are doing or operating in response to the various stimuli and the various conditions under which people are talking or feeling or experiencing. So these are very important breakthroughs that go on. I point out this partly because I did a whole study, and Andy was involved in this as well, on spiritual transformation that we established about 20 odd years ago, just about 20 years, maybe 21 years ago. And many scientists from all over the world, we had 500 plus scientists from all over the world become interested in the whole question of spiritual transformation. And we thought at the time it was because of the interest in this, but it was also promoted at that point in time by the World Trade Center bombing and the tremendous response, social response to that became something that people in the religious domains were interested in. So I point all this out as a historic background. At that point in time, we estimated that there were probably about 100, less than 100 papers a year, 60 to 70 papers a year in the medical literature on spiritual transformation or spirituality. Never mind spiritual transformation. That word almost did not exist. That combination of words in Google did not exist almost at that time. I mean, it literally a couple of handfuls of talks about that where you could find any mention of it. Now, of course, there are millions of mentions of that. But more importantly, in the medical literature, there's a tremendous increase in the amount of concern about spirituality. So now we've moved from maybe, let's say, maybe under 100 papers per year to well over 1,000 papers a year. Now there are 17,500 or so references in the literature on spirituality and medicine. So you can see that Andy's work and began in this room, some of it, 25 or 30 years ago, actually now has multiplied and provided the basis of many, many different pieces of work all over the world, and published many of those pieces. The classic papers on this were published in Zygon. So another thing that we can all be proud of in this room, that was the medium of exchange. So I point all that out, but now I want to go into response to your I come into it, in fact, when you said University of Philadelphia, I laughed to myself. Well, it's University of Pennsylvania, actually, and it was a Center for Research in Child Growth and Development that I was director of, and I want to bring that theme into my question. I used to teach a course on child growth and development, and particularly emphasizing the two stages of childhood that were really critically important to my way of thinking. And in fact, it relates to the paper we heard earlier this week from CJ about the whole question about the endocrinology in some respects of this behavior. So one of those, I won't go into any detail at all, other than to point out in mid-childhood of about ages 6 to 7, 8, well, more like 5, 6, 7, 8, there is a period of time where your adrenal glands that were very active in fetal life suddenly reawaken, and you put out a lot of what are called adrenal androgens that have a profound effect on the development of the brain. We're just understanding that now, but I'm going to talk about it later on, because there's a second series of occurrences that all of us are familiar with, I'm sure, which is sexual maturation at adolescence. And at that point in time, there is a secretion of hormones from either the male testes or the female ovaries that produce a number of changes in the development of the brain, but on top of that, development of the children that experience this. So with respect to the idea of oneness, I cannot help but remember when I would lecture about this, how important it is for the discovery of the self, the oneness of the self, to recognize that there's a way to observe all this. All you need to do is to go home to your adolescent child and watch them before they develop their sexual maturity, and think about this as ritualistic behavior now that Andy talked about initially. Think about the implications of that as they look at themselves in the mirror. And they look at just the detail with which they study their faces in the mirror is absolutely fascinating to understand. There's this sense of, how do I look to the others? I am another, recognizing I'm a self, but also recognizing, do I present myself appropriately to the other? And this is and therefore they study their faces really, really carefully, all kinds of aspects. And I'm sure all of the people in this room have experienced this themselves as they went through adolescence. And to some extent, I think the adolescence sometimes extends up into the early 30s, in fact. But in general, that's a period we all go through as our frontal lobes develop and more other things take over. The point I guess I'm raising then is that there is another side to the kinds of research that you could be doing. And I'd like to ask about that, which is the question about the adolescent self. And I'll bring it back into the medical side, to the psychiatric side for a moment, and talk about the profound effect that social media are having, particularly on girls right now, but boys too, I'm sure. That is the effects of the self as defined in the words of others that then register on this profound concern with the way the adolescent responds to the self. And I think there's a really important piece of research and theme in there that needs to be explored further. And I would like to suggest that you do that. You know, there are many other things that you said. I'll just leave one primary issue in there because it's so critically important and it's so studyable, if you will. Wouldn't it be interesting, Andy, to study, put a mirror in with your neuroimaging and watch adolescents' response to something that you might put in the mirror, as an example, as some early image, whatever the case may be, or watch them reading their social media page for the day.
Right.
And see their expression. So what I'm getting at is that there are very important things that all of us know about, but none of us know the answers to. And there is a great concern about the health implications of all that. And there's the great implication of the media around that theme right now. But I'll just say there are many other things that you talked about. I really enjoyed, I just want to say how much I enjoyed your ending with the differential responses of the patients that you, or subjects that you worked with, and the way in which you were able to show clear differences in the patterns of expression with regard to meditation, with regard to all kinds of other brain activity that would be associated with the behaviors that you registered. I point all this out because there's a world out there for us to discover. There's a world about us to discover with regard to identity. We have all of these questions about identity and concern about identity, sexual identity at this stage, gender identity. What does this mean, and how do we interpret that, and how can the knowledge that you have help us understand that theme within the context of our conference this week? So I'll leave you those couple of points, and I hope that you'll be able to respond. Thank you very much. And
Thanks,
thank you
Sal.
very much for coming back.
Go ahead, Andy, it's your response.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. First of all, it was such a pleasure to have Sal there, and you can hear me okay? Okay. All great ideas. In fact, also a wonderful segue, because the panel that we have on Friday includes, well, 3 wonderful people, but 2 in particular. One is Dr. Lisa Miller, who works at Columbia University, and she wrote a wonderful, I think it was a New York Times bestselling book called The Spiritual Child. And she's focused a lot of her work on that very topic, Sal, that you mentioned about adolescence and adolescent development, and particularly in the context of religion and spirituality. So she'll be a great person to ask about with regard to the self and the development of that self. And then Mike Ferguson, who's at Harvard right now, and he's done also some really interesting imaging studies, again, also kind of propelling that field forward. And of course, my prior student and now colleague, David Yaden, who's doing some fascinating work with psychedelics at Johns Hopkins. So it's a really terrific group, and I think they're going to address some of those very points that you make. You also reminded me a little bit of an article that I think it was an article or a chapter I wrote, maybe a little bit of both, about maybe 10 years ago. I actually wrote it with my wife, Stephanie, who is a therapist and takes care of a lot of adolescents. And we talked a lot about that very thing, about spiritual development. It actually was based in large part off of the work of James Fowler, who wrote Stages of Faith. And what's interesting from the brain perspective is how our brain does change. You kind of alluded to that. But if you look at an infant's brain, where there's basically no cortical activity, if you look at brain scans of an infant, which makes sense because they don't have any thoughts or feelings, they don't have any thoughts or memories per se, but they do have feelings, and they do obviously respond to very basic aspects related to the self. In childhood, that is the time of our most hyper metabolic aspect of our brain, because we actually have an overabundance of connections going on. And so that's part of why kids will think, what to us as adults are strange things, like God is in the toaster or something like that. So they put things together in very funny, weird ways. But that's because they're over connected. And then as we grow, and that development that you're talking about, especially in the adolescent time period, where the brain metabolism is starting to drop, and we're having all of this, as they call, pruning of these different neural connections, the emphasis of social media, of peers, of all these different aspects, everything that happens to us is part of how we kind of elaborate and connect our brains in the ways that become ourself as we enter into early adulthood, and then how that kind of carries us through all the way into older age, and how things continue to evolve and change. But there's so much specifically at that time period. So that is a very formative part. On one hand, our brain functions are starting to lessen because we're pruning all these neurons. But on the other hand, the cortical areas are turning on. So our frontal lobe, as you mentioned, that's when that begins to kick in, probably not really fully until about mid-20s. So the sense of self is really in a huge state of flux from the onset of puberty up until about, certainly the mid-20s, and sometimes a little bit beyond. And all of the issues, as you mentioned, that come about, the influences Are people religious or spiritual? Who are their friends? Did they take drugs? Did they, what is the influence of social media? And all these other factors, as well as their parents and those early connections that are formed. But how stable were they, and what were those relationships like? So so thank you. I mean, it's an incredibly important point, and it's a great piece that I didn't really cover in the talk, but is something that we have definitely thought a lot about and is very relevant to this whole discussion. So thank you so much for bringing that up. And yes, I mean, other than that, I think the ability to explore all of this with imaging and try to understand the brain in these contexts is a very powerful and very exciting future for all of us. So thank you. So looks like we have a question though.
Yes, my name is Chuck Fowler. I'm from state of Washington, near Seattle. And thank you, first of all, for your presentation, which stimulated a thought that I want to translate into a question for you. I think you're probably aware, as a lot of people are, that it's been argued that the consciousness of the universe resides in us, the human. You made the point that the concept of self depends upon a neurological, in part, on a neurological relationship with the environment. My question to you is, what takes the place of the neurological connection with the environment when it comes to the big picture of our species, the biosphere, the larger picture of the life around us? What neurological connections are there to translate that to sense, to provide information about what's going on? Your argument that the neurological connection is, to me, a pathway of information about the environment that helps us develop our sense of consciousness and make decisions. What replaces that at a bigger level?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's a great point, and I guess in my other works, which I guess didn't really talk about as much here, we really do think about how much can you ultimately tie to just biology and how much does go beyond this. And when you think about things like consciousness, and as you mentioned, sort of the bigger picture, where is that overall relationship? Are we ultimately something beyond just the pure biology of who we are? Are we mostly, obviously, if you come from more of a Hindu or Buddhist perspective, you might argue that everything is consciousness. And Jean DeQuilly and I wrote a whole article on consciousness in the brain and kind of address that very issue of, well, does the brain create consciousness? Does consciousness create the brain? Are they, how are they reciprocally interacting with each other? And how do we think about that? And so the short answer is that there is no answer yet, at least as far as I know, but there are certainly lots of different ideas and opinions. But I, in my work, and part of what I think feel very strongly about in the context of the field of neurotheology is that there's an openness to the notion that there may be a materialist perspective, there may be a much more non-materialist perspective, and that maybe somewhere there is a balance between that spiritual and biological side, but we really don't know exactly where all of that occurs. We don't even really know, even in the biology, we don't know where those things occur, if you can even tie it that well. I always challenge my more materialistic neuroscience students that, we have neurons, we have sodium and potassium crossing the membrane, we have electrical changes, we have dopamine and serotonin and all the neurotransmitters, and where in all of that is our actual thought, where in all of that is our consciousness, and there really isn't an answer for that. So I really appreciate your point, because the bottom line is that we don't know, and that to me is a very exciting area for us to continue to explore. I think it's still valid to look at where biological correlates may be, but we need to be open to the notion that it could certainly be something far beyond that as well.
Hi, Andy. My name is Bob Scheibel. I'm from Portland, Maine. And
Good to see
good
you.
to hear you again. I've been here hearing you live before, and you're always a delight to hear. I have a question which might also be a we don't know kind of answer. Niels Bohr once said, when he was asked about trying to explain the quantum level, and he said, well, it's like we have to use something other than mathematical language. We have to use ordinary language. And he said, it's sort of like trying to get dishes clean when you're washing them with dirty water. But so your very last question that you had up there for us, will we ever be able to use consciousness to explain consciousness? Well, once you do all of your imaging, you're then going to maybe come to STAR and you're going to give a talk to explain it all to us, but you're going to be using language. So will you ever be able to do something other than use dirty water? Or will we all just have to have this mystical experience? And then would that be the only way that we can all understand it together?
Well, that was almost going. Thank you. I mean, and it's great to see you. That was almost going to be my answer before you stole it from me. To a certain extent, yeah. I mean, we can look at the brain, we can talk about these things. We can provide information, data, and talk about it in the context of language. Will we be able to do that in such a way that can actually provide that kind of an answer? Possibly. And I'm a never say never kind of guy. But yeah, I mean, it may be, and obviously the basis of pretty much every religious and spiritual tradition is the need for each person to explore these issues and concepts on their own. And so a lot of the answer may ultimately be that each person needs to find that experience on their own. I mean, the only thing that I might add to that is that hopefully maybe we can at least help to guide people down that path a little bit more effectively, and that may be useful to getting people to that kind of an experience and that these deeper notions of reality and so forth. But I guess it does remain to be seen how much each person will have to uncover on their own, where as opposed to providing some kind of picture of here it is. But I think that also is an important point too, which is that if we can provide people that language, maybe that does help them. Goes back to some of my earlier slides about how they begin to incorporate certain ideas and concepts into their belief system. If we can help people to see that that everything that we think about are beliefs and how do we construct them, and keep people more open to other ideas. So much of the conflicts that we see around the country and the world, maybe we can find some ways of chipping away at that and getting people a little bit more open to other sides of things. And being, to me, one of the things I've learned through all of my research is a true appreciation and sense of compassion and understanding of people who have all different kinds of belief systems, even beliefs that are completely different from mine. I appreciate them because I understand that fundamentally we're all kind of in the same place of trying to understand the world in a way, and with very, very limited information and a very finite and very flawed brain, trying to do its best to figure things out. So that's where we all are, and hopefully we'll maybe figure it all out together.
Okay, this is going to be the last question, I believe.
Okay.
This is from an online viewer, Daryl Domning, and I'll read it. What about storage of memories via neural connections that are unique to each individual and really define and constitute each individual? Doesn't this provide a physical rationale for the theological idea of resurrection of the body, and improvement over the idea of an immaterial soul as the basis of immortality?
Yeah, thank you. That's an easy question to end on. Well, we may have to wait around for that answer. But no, actually, interestingly, the last book I did was actually about Jewish thought, and in large part because of my background in Judaism, but I also was connected with a rabbi, and we wrote a book called The Rabbi's Brain. But it also propelled me to think about how we can use neurotheology to explore other traditions. And I'm currently working on a treatise with a nun who also is a cognitive neuroscientist, actually. And we've actually just very recently been sort of hitting these concepts and talking a little bit about that. And that was one of the thoughts that kind of occurred to me about, what actually is happening in that sort of in that kind of end of times situation where what happens with the body, does that have some relationship, some impact if there is a storage of the self, of the memories of who we are, And I guess again, it goes back to the other question too, about, is it really just stored in our brain, or is it really stored in something that goes, a mind or soul or consciousness that goes beyond the brain, which obviously, we don't have the answer to yet. But yes, I mean, it's a very interesting angle to take and a very interesting way of thinking about it, which does lead to some interesting credence to that concept of the resurrection and bringing the body and the soul back together, and what might happen at that kind of a point, especially if the body does maintain those kinds of connections. So, it's a fascinating thought, and certainly something for us to all think about. And unfortunately, though, we may have a bit of a wait until we actually know the answer to that question.
Well, Andrew, we are so glad you were here to join us today. Can everyone give him a round of applause? Yay!
Thank you, everybody.